Responding to active attacks. I'm Pete Blair, the Executive Director of the Advanced Law Enforcement Training Center at Texas State University, and today I'm going to talk about responding to active attacks. And whenever I do that, I think it's always useful to start with an event so that we have something in mind to think about. So today I'm going to begin by talking about the Parkland, Florida shooting that happened in February of 2018. This particular day, a former student returned to his school and began shooting at classmates. As he began shooting across the campus, there was a school resource officer who heard the gunfire. He came across campus to the building where the shooting was happening, but rather than entering, he stayed outside and began putting out radio calls about perimeters and traffic and things like that. The shooting went on for about 6 minutes. Then the attacker put down his gun, left the building by pretending as if he was another student fleeing the attack, and he was apprehended a short time later, a short distance away. After he had left the building, the police did make entry to the building. They started to encounter a lot of wounded people. And there was disagreement between the fire, police, and EMS services about how to deal with the wounded people. Fire and EMS wanted to push into the building. The sheriff's office did not want them to do that and instead wanted to bring victims out to them. The end result was that we had 17 people who were killed and 17 that were wounded. And whenever we see an event like that, the natural question is, how do we do better? I'm going to suggest that there are 3 things that should be done in order to perform better. The first one is to stop the killing, the second one is to stop the dying, and the third one is to start the recovery. The other thing I'm going to argue for is that we change our definition of these attacks a little bit. Traditionally, we've talked about these as being active shooter events, and certainly we see a lot of firearms used in these sorts of attacks. But if you think back to the beginning of the modern era of these events, which I would say is Columbine in 1999, there were IEDs that were used in that attack, and we've seen IEDs appear periodically throughout that. And then if you look at various terrorist jihadi recruitment magazines that there are throughout the world, like Inspire magazine, they've been encouraging attackers to use other things like knives, vehicles, or even more recently, fire as a weapon. So when we look at those things, I think we need to change our definition from active shooter to active attack. And in a nutshell, when I say active attack, what I mean is somebody went to a location with the intent to commit mass murder. It's not critical to us exactly how many people were injured, because we think we can learn as much from events where very few people is hurt as we can from events where there are a lot of people that are hurt. What I'm going to show you now is a map that shows where these events have happened from 2000 to 2016. The small dots correspond with up to 4 people being injured. The large dots are 4 or more people being injured. The different colors represent the different modalities that caused the most casualties in the event, if there were multiple modalities that were used. And I'll let this just roll out for a second. So you can see these happen north, south, east, west, urban, rural, suburban. Really nowhere you can point to and say they just don't happen there. Also, you'll see that as the map rolled out, we had more of the other colored dots start to appear. So we're seeing more of these other modalities happen more recently, which is another argument, I think, for talking about these as active attacks as opposed to active shooter events. And there are a lot of these events. From 2000 to 2016, we've identified 242 different events that have occurred. There are also some other key numbers that we see in the data. The first one is that 98% of the attackers are solo attackers. In the 2% where there were more than one attacker, what we see is that they stay together and operate as a team. This means that if you go into an attack site and you encounter one attacker, chances are you've encountered all the attackers that are there. It doesn't mean that it's always going to be that way, but historically it has been that way. The other thing we see is that police response time is very rapid at these events. The typical response from 911 call until the first officer arrives on scene is 3 minutes. Those of you in law enforcement know that's lightning fast. You're just not going to do any better than that unless you get lucky and there happens to be an officer right there when an attack starts. The other thing we see in the data, though, is that the attacks themselves are very quick. 7 out of 10 attacks are over in less than 5 minutes. So if you think about that, a 3-minute response time to get there and then 5 minutes to the typical attack goes on, that suggests that in a lot of these attacks there's a very narrow window to actually have police officers arrive and intervene in order to affect the outcome. The other thing is that we tend to think about these attacks as being mass casualty events, but the injury pattern that we typically see is that there are 4 people that are hurt, and of the 4 people that are hurt, 2 people die. So most of these events are not big mass casualty events, but they certainly can be that way. Now, also in looking at the data, there are a variety of other problems that we see. The first problem we see is that there's mass confusion at the outset of the event. For that first 5, 10, 15 minutes, it's unclear what's happening. It's unclear how many attackers there are, what kind of weapons they're using, how many people have been hurt, and exactly what needs to be done. The second thing we see is this problem of overconvergence, where we have too many officers approaching the scene at one time. When that initial call goes out and everybody starts going, that's very helpful because we probably need a lot of people to deal with that initial problem. But after that first group of officers arrives and we start getting dozens, if not hundreds of more officers arriving, that can create real problems as far as being able to get into the scene and being able to coordinate things and being able to get people out of the scene who are injured. And the third thing we see in these events is this issue of what I would call fragility, which is response policies that are written in such a way that they can break down at a single point of failure. And the most common one we see is when there's a policy that's written that says a lieutenant has to do this particular function during the event, like start incident command. And then what we see in the event is that something happens and that lieutenant's not available. They get in a traffic accident driving to the scene, or they're the first person on scene and they engage the bad guy and they're injured themselves and they're not available. So those are three common problems that we see during these events. So if we look at this situation, we look at this complex pattern where events happen in urban, rural, suburban environments. They happen in different types of structures, different buildings with different numbers of people that are injured. With all this complexity, how do you respond to that? What do you do? The first thing that we argue is that you have to have a flexible response policy. You can't try to dictate everything that's going to happen because these events are just too varied and too different from each other to do that. So you need to be flexible. You need to allow your officers to read the scene and then act as they think is appropriate. And I know that that's terrifying for a lot of you administrators because what we're saying is we want you to trust your line officers to do thinking. But we have seen them do this effectively. We know they can do it effectively. And we give them some priorities to help them understand what they need to do. And those priorities are to first stop the killing, second stop the dying, and third start the recovery. So when officers arrive on scene, if they arrive on scene and there are people being killed, their first and only task is to isolate, distract, or neutralize the attacker. Stop the gunfire, stop the vehicle from going through the crowd, whatever it takes to do that. Once the stop the killing's been accomplished, then it's time to switch gears and transition to stopping the dying. People have been injured. They need medical assistance. Some of them may die within minutes. Some of them may take longer, but they need help as quickly as we can get it to them. And the first part in that is that we've been providing medical training to police officers around the country, and we know that officers can effectively use tourniquets and other basic medical interventions in order to save lives, and we've seen them save lives across the country. But let's be honest about that. If I have a choice between having officers provide me with medical care and having fire or EMS professional EMTs provide medical care, I want the EMTs to provide my medical care. They have a bigger skill set, they practice it more often, they're just better at it. So we want to get them into the scene as quickly as possible. But there's also mass confusion and chaos early on in these events, and that's where concepts like the Rescue Task Force come in, where we have police providing some security to a medical element to go into a scene that's not really a hot zone where there's active gunfire, but rather a warm zone where there still could be some risk because we haven't been able to search the whole area yet, but we don't think it's a large risk in order to get that medical care in there more quickly to provide better care to people and hopefully stabilize them and have more people survive. The other thing we see from looking at the wounding pattern in these events, though, is that many of the people who are savable are only going to be savable if they get to a surgeon. The injuries they have are too severe to deal with on the scene, and it is only surgery that will save them and prevent them from dying. And so that's where transporting them from the scene where they've been injured to definitive care becomes critical. And that's another area where fire and EMS are better than law enforcement. They have better triage capability than we do. They have specialized vehicles designed to transport and treat while they're transporting, and they understand the local medical system as far as capability and capacity better than law enforcement does. Once the last injured person has been transported off the scene to definitive care, then we enter the last phase of that response, which is starting the recovery. This is the phase when all the other tasks that need to be accomplished in order to end the event go on. That includes evacuating people who are still in the site that weren't injured, reunifying people with their families and friends, conducting the investigation, and probably more importantly, providing long-term care for the people who are involved in the event and also your first responders, because we know these are very traumatic events and can have a big impact on their lives. So now I'm going to talk about something that's uncomfortable for a lot of law enforcement, and that's incident command. And I'm not talking about the big chart that you got in your ICS class. I'm talking about how do we get some control over a very chaotic situation so that we can save lives. And believe it or not, incident command is the secret sauce that makes that happen. I'm also going to argue that incident command begins with the first officer that's on the scene. That officer needs to give a size-up report, let people know what's going on at the location, what they're going to do, and what resources they need. And they need to get on the radio and say, I have command. Now, it's going to be different than your normal command. They're not going to sit outside and just watch and see what's going on. It's going to be a mobile command. So if there's active killing going on, they're going to go in and take part in stopping the killing. But the command starts with them. After they go in the building, other officers arrive. Maybe you have a contact team, 2 contact teams that are in the building in front of them. Maybe they've already encountered the attacker and stopped the attacker that way. One of the other officers that's arriving a little bit later needs to understand that if I just push into the building and start randomly searching around, I'm not helping the situation. Rather, I need to stop outside and I need to take command. We call this position tactical position later on when the command structure builds out. But that officer is going to arrive. They're going to realize that they shouldn't go in. They're going to call to the current incident commander, get a size-up report from that incident commander, and then they're going to say, I have command. And they become the new incident commander. The very first task they're going to do is going to be to set staging. They're going to look for a location where they can fit a lot of units in, and they're going to say staging is now set at that location. After that, we need to train our law enforcement officers that once staging's been set, you can no longer go directly to the building. You have to go to staging first. And that's critical because we have other tasks that need to be done besides just officers randomly patrolling around the building, such as creating rescue task forces, creating quick reaction forces, setting perimeter teams, all those other things that need to be done. And that can only be accomplished if we have the officers as deployable resources, which is why we require them to go to staging. And that's going to be a big change, but that's actually how we're going to start to save lives. The other thing that incident commander is going to do is immediately look for the fire and EMS commanders who have already arrived or who are arriving at that time and get together with them so that they get unified and we have true unified command and can use our resources together. So when it comes to saving lives, we're going to accomplish that by first stopping the killing. If there's killing going on at the site, when officers arrive, that is their first and only job, is to stop anybody else from being murdered. The second thing we do then is to stop the dying. People have been hurt. They need medical assistance as quickly as they can. And the secret sauce that makes that work is that we get in incident command as quickly as possible. And if we're really going to be successful, we need to be in a unified command where police, fire, and EMS are all working together to save lives.